Okay, so you might notice in the video the interface had just a few little minor changes. Some of the colors changed here. That's because I closed 3ds Max 2010 and I reopened it so that it would finish the interface change to the light version here that we spoke about before. Okay, so let's get started. Let's open up the first example scene that comes with this training product. So we'll hit Control and O on the keyboard to open up the file browser here. And the scene that you want to open up is going to be called 01 Scene Primitives Start. So let's go ahead and click on that and hit open. It'll go ahead and load up this scene. Now you might get this little dialog here. It says, do you want gamma LUT correction to be enabled to correspond with the setting in this file? Let's go ahead and hit no. Okay. Alright, so it's a pretty simple basic scene here. Just a ground plane, which is actually a little bit difficult to see. But there's some primitive shapes on top of that. And it's very, very simple. Now, the process of rendering is actually taking all the lighting and the colors, materials, and a whole bunch of different elements of your scene and outputting a final image. In some cases, a final animation. Depending on the type of 3D project you're working on, 3ds Max allows you to work on many different projects, whether it's a still render, just one image, or a sequence of images known as, well, an animation. Now in this case we're dealing with just a simple scene here, and we're going to do some rendered stills. So how do we render out with the mental ray renderer? Well, the first thing we need to do is make sure that we know if the mental ray plugin is actually loaded up, because we don't know right now just by looking at this scene which renderer is being used, the default scanline or the mental ray renderer. So we'll go up to the rendering menu and open up the render setup window, which is F10 by default. Okay, and if we go down to assign renderer, the assign renderer rollout down here, we can see that down here in the production, mental ray renderer is in fact selected. If it wasn't, I would have to hit this button and then go ahead and load it up, but it is, so I'm not going to worry about it. So now that we know that the mental ray renderer is loaded up, we can actually go ahead and start doing a test render. So to do a test render very quickly, we can use icons here on the interface, or we can use a shortcut key. During this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you the long way of doing things, the long way being coming up here to a specific menu item and selecting it. If there's a default shortcut key associated with that, I'm going to go ahead and let you know. That way you know how to do it both ways. I strongly recommend that once you get more used to 3ds Max, you go ahead and learn all the shortcuts, because it's a lot faster to work that way and you'll be more efficient. So up here we have a series of buttons. We have a render setup. And you notice that when you hover your mouse over these buttons, you get a little tooltip that gives you the name of the actual button or tool. In this case, this button here on the left is called the render setup window. It's got an icon of a little teapot and a little square icon right there in the lower right. Here we have another larger square icon for teapot in the middle. That's the rendered frame window. And over here on the right, we have the render production button that just has a single teapot. You also notice there's a little black tick mark down here. It appears to be a little triangle on the lower right. Whenever you see a menu item in 3ds Max that has that little icon, it means that you can click and hold the left mouse button and you get a little submenu. And the submenu may have several different icons here or different buttons. That's to switch this button out to a different one that's going to do a different type of operation. Usually it's something similar, sometimes it's something completely different. In this case we get ourselves 3 buttons. The teapot one, which is the active one right now, and we also get these 2 other ones down here. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So we'll go with the first button here, which is the render production button. We can actually go ahead and click on that button, and you'll see that 3ds Max is going to go ahead and create a render. Now the render is going to go by really, really fast in this case. Okay, and here's our scene rendered out to the final image. What I want to talk about in this video is the render frame window. This right here that we see here is the render frame window. If you close the render frame window, you can open it back up again simply by going up here to this icon called the rendered frame window. You don't want to click on this one here on the right again, because what that's going to do, it's going to render out again. And right now it's rendering out fast, but if this were a complicated scene with lots of complex lighting, the render could take a pretty long time. So to not waste time, if we just want to open up the render frame window, we click on this button here in the middle, called the render frame window button. So we'll click on that, and you notice that it doesn't render, it just opens this window back up again. And this window has a lot of different icons and a pretty complex UI when you look at it the first time. So I'm going to go ahead and skim over this and give you a brief overview of some of the most important buttons that you'll be using quite often on this render frame window. And we're going to go ahead and demystify some of this stuff here. Okay, so the render frame window, let's start up here with the top left. Over here there's a section called area to render. So what does this area do here? Well, you can choose different options here for how you render out using a render frame window. The default option is view. What view means is that you're going to be able to render out anything that's in the view of our camera here or of our viewport here in 3ds Max. You can also switch to render out only the selected object. So for example, I can select that mode. In my viewport window, I can, for example, select this sphere. Okay, once I have it selected, I can go down here to this really big render button. I can click on that, and you notice that now mental ray is only rendering out the sphere. It'll only render out what I have selected. If I go ahead and select a group of objects here, hit render again, it's going to render out just those objects. You notice that other objects like this cone didn't render out, this cube back here didn't render out, and I believe there's a cylinder back there that didn't render out, etc., etc. I think you get the idea. So that's the selected mode. We also have a region mode here. When I select the region mode, you'll notice that this render region window or frame opens up here. You also notice that there's selection handles on the corners and on the sides. And when I hover my mouse over these selection handles, my mouse cursor changes to let me know how I can modify this render region area using my mouse. So if I just hover my mouse over anywhere inside this frame, I can click and drag this frame anywhere I want. But basically what that allows me to do is to just render out a specific region. So if I go ahead and frame in on a specific area and resize this frame however I want, I can click on render, and only that area is going to render. Why is this useful? Well, it's useful for when you're doing preview renderings and you're testing out your lighting in your scene and you have to save time, because rendering a small region like this is much faster than rendering a larger region or even rendering the entire frame or area. That could take a long time. So this is a very useful tool for rendering out mental ray and getting your look development done in a faster amount of time. If you want to close this render frame right here, just click on this little X icon on the top right, and you pretty much close that mode out. It'll still render region, but you won't have to worry about this frame here being moved around or anything. Basically locks it in place. When you're ready to work with it again, you notice here there's these three buttons. The first button here is the edit region button. If we click on that, it activates the rendered frame window again. So I can go ahead and adjust this region however I want. When I'm done, I can go ahead and click on that little X there, and it'll just lock it in place so I don't accidentally move it or resize it or anything like that. Then there's this button here on the right that says Auto Region Selected. What this button does is if I come in here and I select a specific object, say this cube right there, okay, and I select this button, you notice that the frame disappears, but it's actually still there. What happens is that the renderer is going to go ahead and automatically place the region over the selected object, which happens to be the cube. So I'll hit render, and you notice that the cube renders out, which is actually pretty neat. And then over here we have this button. And this button allows you to go ahead and render out subpixels of selected objects. What that basically translates to is that rendering will go by a lot faster, and it's very good for when you're doing repeated iterations of the same render over and over again, because only the specific changes that changed anything like shadows, color, lighting, and so on and so forth will be taken into account. So it's very good when you're doing test renders of the same thing over and over again, and you're trying to tweak a specific material or perhaps a light or the shadows of a particular light. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and turn that off, and what I'm going to do is switch over here to another mode. We also have the crop mode here, and if we go ahead and use the crop mode, and I'm going to click on this button here to do a specific, to control my frame here, and if I minimize this window, you can see that I can actually change this frame, move it around inside of my viewport, which can actually be pretty useful. So I'm going to go ahead and resize this frame here to fit around this cylinder. Okay, I'm going to hit render. And what's going to happen is it's just going to crop out that area, as you can see here in the render frame window, which could be pretty useful. It's just another different way of rendering. And these buttons over here remain the same. Sometimes you notice this warning button that pops up here, and if you hover over it, you get a little warning here to tell you about something. Maybe something can be changed, something can be done better, and that's what that little tooltip there is for. Let's switch over here to blow up mode. Okay, and with blow up mode, it's the same thing. I can move this this little render frame window here, or this region window, and I can place it wherever I need to in my scene. And when I go ahead and hit the render button, what's going to happen is that the render is going to go ahead and blow up. It's basically like doing a zoom in render of the specific region that I selected in the viewport. Okay, so let me go back to the view mode here, and I'll hit the render button again. There we go. Okay, so let's move on here. Over here in the viewport section of options, we can change which viewport we want to render by. Now right now we only have a perspective. If we had several cameras in the scene, we could actually go ahead and select them from the drop down list. In this case we don't have several cameras, so we only have one option, which is the perspective viewport. Okay, we can also lock down a specific view that we're rendering from. So if we had several of them, we can lock down a specific one to make sure it doesn't change. Then we have render presets. You have several render presets you can choose from here, the default ones that come with 3ds Max and Mental Ray. You can also create your own presets, load them up, and save them out for use later. Then over here we have the render setup button, and this is basically going to go ahead and do a shortcut and jump you right into the render setup window that we've seen before. Okay, so it's just there for convenience. We have this other button here. If we click on that, it opens up the environment effects window. We're going to be looking at that during this tutorial a lot more, so don't worry about that. And over here we have a series of buttons that let us do different things. We can save the image out. We can also copy the image to the clipboard, to the Windows clipboard. We can also clone the rendered frame window. If we click on that, basically just clones the image here to render to its own floating window here. And we're going to see how useful that can be for comparing before and after renders later on. We can also print this image out, and we can also clear the image out. Just by clicking on that, we get rid of the image. Then we can render again to do a new render. Then right here we can actually isolate the different color channels of the image, show the alpha, show it in monochrome. Here won't make a difference because this is already a gray render. Okay. Then over here we have an RGB and alpha selection box, which basically is going to show you the different channels that are rendered out with the image. In this case, the red, green, and blue, as well as an alpha channel were rendered out. Then we have these two other buttons here. Now the one on the left toggles the UI overlays, and the one on the right toggles the UI. So if you want to get rid of all of this UI stuff here for whatever reason, you can go ahead and click on that. Now you get a very simple, very simplified rendered frame window with less buttons and less clutter here if you prefer that. And then you can bring back the UI, of course. And the button on the left, you notice here it's not appearing to do anything. That's because let's go ahead and switch over here to, say, a region mode. You notice that we have the little rendered frame, the little render region here. Okay. If we want to get rid of that, we can actually click on that button, and it toggles it off, toggles it back on. So in case you want to get rid of that, you can go ahead and get rid of it and bring it back if you need to. Now down here we have a specific set of options that relate specifically to Mental Ray and only Mental Ray. We have image precision, also known as anti-aliasing, and we can switch from very, very low to very high, and the higher it's set to, the longer the render is going to take. The lower it's set, the faster the render is going to be. So when we're doing preview rendering and we're working on a specific project, which we will be working on several projects for this training product, we're going to be using lower anti-aliasing settings to render out faster. When we're ready to do a final production render, we'll increase the anti-aliasing settings or the image precision settings here. We can also do the same thing for soft shadows, so we can increase the quality of soft shadows, which will take longer to render, decrease them to render out faster previews. We can do the same thing with glossy reflections, and we'll look at that a little bit later, as well as glossy refractions. It'll make a lot more sense later. And we also have final gathering. Now, if you're new to Mental Ray, you don't know what final gathering is, you may have heard the term before, or maybe not. Don't worry about that. We're going to be going over final gathering in this training product. Okay. And we also have the ability to quickly change the reflections and refractions with our ray tracing, as well as our final gather bounces. And again, we'll talk about that during this training product, so don't worry about it. By the end of this whole thing, you're going to be all too familiar with what this stuff means. We have a reuse section of parameters here where we can reuse and cache our geometry, as well as reuse and cache our final gather map. Again, we'll talk about that stuff later, so if it doesn't make any sense now, don't worry about it. It's not meant to. And we also have an option here to change from iterative mode to production mode. When we're ready to do final render, we want to use production mode. When we're still doing test renders, we want to use iterative mode, and you'll see how that works later on. And of course, we have this big render button here that we've been using so far to render out our scene here using Mental Ray. Okay, so that's going to cover it here for the render frame window and what we're going to be using here to render this stuff out. Okay, and just to wrap up this video, the shortcut key for going ahead and doing test renders here with the rendered frame window is by default Shift and Q on the keyboard. So just hit Shift and Q and you'll quickly do a test render here instead of having to go up here to the interface and clicking on the button every single time, which can take longer. And you don't even have to go here and hit this big render button here. I can just keep hitting Shift and Q as many times as I need to and keep doing these test renders out. So shortcuts, you're going to notice that I use a lot of shortcuts, and I'm going to show you what the shortcuts are during this tutorial. That way you can learn them and it'll increase your speed and efficiency when working on your projects, which is actually very, very important in this industry. Okay, so let me close this. Now the other thing I just want to show you very quickly is that in this render frame window we can actually zoom in and out on images using the middle mouse button here, or the middle mouse scrolling wheel. We can actually zoom in and zoom out. When you're zoomed in, you can actually pan and move around just by clicking in the middle mouse button or the scroll wheel and just dragging around. Same way that you would pan and move around inside of your viewports. Of course, we can't rotate here because it's a 2D image. Okay, so to zoom back out, just use the middle mouse wheel to scroll out. And you notice up here in parentheses it says 1 to 1. If I zoom in one time, it's going to say 2 to 1. So I'm zoomed in 200% here. And I can zoom in again. Now we're at the 4 to 1 ratio, 8 to 1, so on and so forth. And if we zoom out, we'll be at 1 to 2, which is half, 1 to 4, which is a quarter, and so on and so forth. Okay, so now we're back to 1 and 1, which we can see up here, which is the default image size. Okay, so let me close that. Alright, we're done with this video. I'm going to end it here, and in the next one, we'll just continue here with Mental Ray.